I'm Lily, 29 years old, and the last time my mother saw me in a polyester apron with a name tag that said Lily, server, she called me embarrassing. She said it loudly enough for everyone in the diner to hear, loud enough for my manager to freeze behind the counter, loud enough for me to feel that familiar tightening in my chest, the one I'd been carrying since childhood. "Do you really have to work here?" she said, scanning the room like I had personally offended her existence. "I raised you better than this." I froze, but not out of fear. I froze because this was nothing new. The world had been telling me I wasn't enough since I could remember, and my mother had just been louder about it than most. But what she didn't know was that it was my last day. I had been planning for months, quietly, without telling a soul, building a life that didn't need her approval, a life she couldn't touch. This was my moment, and she walked in unaware that the very thing she thought embarrassed her was about to be the stage of my liberation. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It wasn't a big house, not in terms of size, but it felt suffocating. My mother's voice carried more weight than my father's absence. My earliest memories aren't of toys or birthdays, they are of judgment. I remember spilling milk on the counter when I was 5. She didn't raise her voice in anger. Her tone was sharper than anger, sharper than disappointment. "You're so careless, Lily," she said. "Do you know how hard it is to raise someone like you?" My father had been in the room, somewhere, but like always, he disappeared before the punishment was dealt. And that was the pattern of my childhood. Mistakes were amplified, accomplishments were expected, and love was conditional, tied to performance and appearance. By the time I was 7, I had learned to apologize before I even understood the mistake. I walked on tiptoe, ate slowly, spoke carefully, measured every word. My younger brother Daniel could do anything, spill juice, forget homework, cry over scraped knees, and he was rewarded for effort. I was expected to succeed without recognition. School was both my escape and my battlefield. Teachers praised me, classmates sought my help, but at home my victories were minimized. "Good job," my mother might murmur, followed by, "Your brother tried too, you know." By 12, my father had largely checked out. My mother filled the void with pressure and comparisons. She constantly reminded me that appearances mattered. "You have to look perfect," she said. "You have to behave the right way. People judge you before they know you." So I learned to hide, to perform, to make myself invisible when necessary and loud enough to impress when required. Survival became my instinct. I learned to smile when I was anxious, to nod when I disagreed, and to swallow my own needs to keep the peace. By 13, I worked small jobs, babysitting, delivering newspapers, saving every penny. My mother never asked why, only reminded me that it was trivial compared to my brother's accomplishments. At 16, I started waitressing. Initially, it was just for extra cash, but soon it became my lifeline. Standing on my feet for hours, juggling tables, reading customers' moods, smiling through exhaustion, I learned endurance in a way school never taught. My mother didn't approve. She said, "You should be focusing on school, not serving food." But serving food, managing 5 tables at a time, surviving lunch rushes, it gave me something school never could: confidence in my own strength. College years were harder. I earned scholarships, but not enough to cover rent, food, and books. I worked nights and weekends, sometimes double shifts, crying silently in the library at 2 a.m., exhausted and invisible. When I called home, my mother would ask about grades, but never how I felt. She reminded me my brother had internships, dates, a life. Mine was a ledger of what I lacked compared to him. By the time I graduated, I had internalized the lesson: love and approval were not guaranteed. I became fiercely self-reliant, quietly resentful, and constantly calculating how to survive without dependence. Then came the breakthrough, the turning point. A startup I had applied to nearly a year earlier called me back. Interviews, assessments, late-night prep. My life became a balancing act of hope and fear. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't let my mother know. She had no idea. 3 months later, before she walked into the diner that Friday night, I had signed an offer letter for a 6-figure position, health benefits, everything I had dreamed of. I had also signed for a small condo, my own space, mine entirely. That Friday, she walked in, perfect hair, designer bag, radiating the judgment that had haunted me for decades. She sat at a table near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning, lips pressed in thin lines. "You're embarrassing," she said, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. I took her order, black coffee, and smiled politely. Inside, I was laughing silently. She had no idea that the very thing she was calling shameful was about to become my liberation. After my shift, my manager hugged me. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. I left the diner under the afternoon sun, feeling light for the first time in decades. The girl she thought was embarrassed was standing taller than she ever imagined. Weeks passed. I moved, started my new job, built a life she couldn't touch. She noticed. She called one night, curious and worried. "So, what's next?" she asked. I smiled. "I'll tell you in person." When she arrived at my condo, dressed like she was attending a gala, I poured wine and calmly explained my new life. Job, condo, independence, 6-figure salary, health benefits, freedom. Her face went from confusion to disbelief to fear. "Who called me embarrassing?" I said softly. "I just wanted you to know I was never embarrassed of myself. I was embarrassed that you thought appearances mattered more than love." Months went by. We talk occasionally. She asks advice, needing help. I give it, calmly, kindly. The deepest satisfaction isn't revenge. It's living a life she can't control. I survived her. I thrived without her. The version of me she dismissed, mocked, and belittled is the one that made it. And that, finally, is my satisfaction. I spent years standing on the diner floor, trays balanced precariously, smiling while my body screamed for rest. The lunch rush was merciless, the coffee spills endless, the complaints constant. Every day I reminded myself, this isn't forever. This is a stepping stone. Every plate carried, every smile forced, every late night double shift was building the life I knew I deserved. Yet my mother's words haunted me like a shadow. "You're embarrassing." I replayed them constantly, not in anger, not even in shame, but in a quiet, simmering resolve. Every time I heard her voice echoing in my mind, it was a reminder that she had underestimated me, that she had never truly seen me, and that one day she would realize just how wrong she had been. Customers didn't know the history behind my smile. They didn't see the trembling hands beneath the tray, the anxiety that clenched my stomach when a rude comment or a judgmental glance came my way. But I did, and I learned to channel it, to survive the humiliation and keep moving forward. There were days I wanted to scream. One afternoon, a man slammed a $5 bill onto the table, complaining about the soup being lukewarm, and I nearly dropped the tray. My manager rushed over, whispering, "Ignore him. You're doing fine." But the damage was done. My mother's voice seeped into that moment, sharp and cutting. "You're embarrassing." I walked home that night, the cold biting my cheeks, my feet aching, and I thought about the life I was building. Every penny I saved, every opportunity I seized, was for one reason: freedom. Freedom from her judgments, from the endless comparisons, from the suffocating expectation that my worth was tied to appearances rather than resilience. It wasn't just the work. It was the small betrayals too. Friends who couldn't understand why I was working nights while attending classes during the day. Boyfriends who envied my ambition but couldn't see the sacrifice. And worst of all, family members who told me to settle because success wasn't meant for someone like me. Every slight, every dismissal, every whispered criticism was fuel. Fuel for a plan that was quietly taking shape in the corners of my mind. I began to notice patterns in my mother's behavior. Her obsession with appearances, her need to control, her tendency to belittle achievements she couldn't claim. And I realized something crucial. She thrived on ignorance. The less she knew about my actual accomplishments, the more power she had over me. So I learned secrecy. I compartmentalized my life. College achievements, internships, freelance work, and job applications, all hidden from her. I created a world she couldn't touch, couldn't influence, couldn't sabotage. Every paycheck saved, every document signed in private, every opportunity seized became a brick in the foundation of my eventual independence. And yet, the humiliation persisted. During one particularly busy shift, a customer criticized my posture, another complained about my voice, and I overheard a co-worker whispering about how pathetic it was that I needed this job. That night I cried in the restroom, letting the tears soak into my apron, and I made a vow. One day all of this, every insult, every dismissive word, every moment of being called embarrassing, would be irrelevant. I began to strategize, quietly, methodically. Every savings account, every opportunity for career growth, every bit of networking became part of a plan she couldn't foresee. I studied investment strategies, job prospects, and property ownership. I learned the language of contracts, legal obligations, and independence. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing for the moment when I would finally take control. There were nights when the exhaustion threatened to break me. My body ached, my soul felt worn. But even then I visualized the future, a small apartment that was mine, a career I could be proud of, a life where my mother's approval was irrelevant. And I held on to that vision, letting it carry me through every exhausting shift, every humiliating encounter, every whispered judgment. By the time I was 25, I had not only survived, but I had begun to thrive in secret. I had secured a job interview with a prestigious company, hidden from my mother's knowledge. I had saved enough for a deposit on my first apartment, completely independent, and most importantly, I had discovered something she could never take away: confidence in my own worth. It wasn't about revenge yet, not directly. It was about empowerment, about proving to myself that I could rise above every insult, every belittlement, every moment of embarrassment. But I knew the time for direct confrontation would come. And when it did, I would be ready. Because the little girl who had been told she was embarrassing while pouring milk at age 5 had grown into a woman who knew her value. And that woman was quietly, patiently, preparing for the moment when she would show the world and her mother just how strong, capable, and unstoppable she truly was. The day I got the call, I was wiping down tables, elbows aching, a tray full of coffee in my hands. My manager's face flashed a small, knowing smile as I answered the phone. "Lily? We'd like to offer you the position," said the voice on the other end. My chest tightened, my hands shook, not from the coffee, not from exhaustion, but from a surge of disbelief and hope. It was the job I had dreamed about for years, challenging, rewarding, something that would finally validate everything I had worked for in secret. The kind of work my mother had always insisted I was overqualified for, yet somehow incapable of achieving. I hung up, blinked back tears, and for a fleeting moment the diner noise faded. Orders called out, chairs scraped, the espresso machine hissed, but I heard nothing but the pulse of my own heart, racing at the idea that I had made it. That night I sat alone in my tiny apartment, exhausted from the shift but electrified by the possibilities. I spread out the spreadsheets I'd been keeping for years, tracking every savings account, every potential investment, every opportunity that could lead to freedom. For the first time, all the late nights, all the humiliation, all the exhaustion felt like they had a purpose. I started drafting a plan, not revenge yet. First, independence. First, control over my life. I looked at the calendar, mapped out the next 6 months and visualized every step. Start the new job, save aggressively, secure my condo, build a buffer. Step by step, methodically, I could leave behind every insult, every belittlement, every moment of humiliation that had defined my 20s. Weeks passed. I aced the interviews, navigated office politics, and slowly carved out a place for myself where my competence mattered more than my lineage. My co-workers didn't know my mother. They didn't know the years I had spent surviving her judgments. They only knew a dedicated, smart, reliable woman who could deliver results. And I thrived in that space. Meanwhile, at home, my mother remained blissfully ignorant. She called occasionally, inquiring about my life, subtly probing for failures, for reasons to lecture. I smiled and deflected, always careful to reveal just enough to keep her thinking she had insight while maintaining full control over what she knew. And then came the condo. Small, modest, yet completely mine. I signed the papers in secret, funds saved from years of double shifts, freelance work, and careful budgeting. As I held the keys in my hand, a rush of triumph filled me. Finally, a space that wasn't subject to her scrutiny. Finally, a life that belonged entirely to me. It was around this time that I realized the next phase wasn't just independence, it was satisfaction. Quiet, calculated, and undeniable satisfaction. I began documenting every insult, every belittlement, every moment she had called me embarrassing. Notes, emails, journals, receipts. It wasn't revenge yet, it was preparation. I wanted a record, a plan, a safety net. The more I organized, the more I felt the power shifting. Then came the first test. My mother invited herself over to see how I was doing and was visibly shocked to find a tidy, independent apartment, evidence of careful planning and resourcefulness. She tried to mask her surprise, but the subtle disbelief in her eyes was unmistakable. "You've really made something of yourself," she said, voice tight with a mix of admiration and restrained jealousy. I smiled, quietly savoring the moment. "It's all from my hard work," I said. No help required. The seed of satisfaction planted itself firmly in my chest. She had always thrived on control, on appearances. Now she saw the results of my independence, a reality she hadn't orchestrated. And it was intoxicating. From that point forward, I began to set small, deliberate challenges for her perception. I achieved milestones quietly, never boasting, never asking for recognition, yet ensuring that when she observed, the success was undeniable. Promotions, raises, personal achievements, all milestones she couldn't dismiss, all proofs of my resilience and intelligence. And in parallel, I started plotting the ultimate satisfaction, not to humiliate her, not to inflict pain, but to claim a life she had tried to dictate and assert the boundaries she had never respected. The plan was meticulous, slow, and deliberate. It would take months, perhaps years, but I had the patience now. I had the endurance, the strategy, and the clarity that came from surviving decades of judgment. Every morning, every shift, every long commute, every night spent poring over contracts and finances, I reminded myself, the girl she called embarrassing was gone. In her place stood a woman who was unshakable, unbroken, and quietly unstoppable. By the time she walked into my life expecting the familiar, obedient daughter, she would be met with something entirely new, confidence, autonomy, and a reality that no amount of her judgment could alter. And I would savor it, not because she had wronged me, but because I had finally claimed myself. Every insult, every belittlement, every humiliating memory would be rendered powerless by the life I had built, the independence I had carved out, and the undeniable proof of my worth. The waitressing shifts, the ridicule, the whispered criticisms, they were all part of the story that had led me here. And the best part? She had no idea it was happening under her radar, that the very life she tried to control was quietly thriving beyond her reach. For the first time in my life, I felt what it truly meant to be untouchable. Not in arrogance, not in spite, but in calm, deliberate mastery of my own destiny. The day finally arrived, though I had been preparing for it in my mind for years. Every slight, every judgment, every whispered insult had built a roadmap in my heart, and now it was time to follow it carefully. I watched from the shadows at first, quietly observing my mother as she carried on her life, blissfully unaware that her power over me had already begun to slip. She believed I was still the quiet, obedient daughter, the one who would bend to her rules, accept her criticisms, and tremble under her words. But she was wrong. I had been waiting silently for the moment when control would shift. It started small. I sent anonymous letters to her friends, subtly highlighting my achievements and the independence she had failed to recognize. They were curious, impressed, and even a little shocked, but I remained hidden, invisible. Then came the documentation. I had collected every insult, every belittlement, every time she had called me embarrassing, lazy, or selfish. Every note, every message, every recording became a shield, a silent testament to her inability to see my worth. The satisfaction was not instantaneous. It built slowly, like a fire smoldering beneath a blanket of ashes. I knew that when the time came, the impact would be total, not out of spite, but as a quiet assertion of my life, my boundaries, and my identity. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. She had come to my apartment, perhaps sensing something was different, something she couldn't control. I greeted her calmly, poured her a cup of tea, and led her into the living room. The room was modest but immaculate, a reflection of careful planning and disciplined independence. "You've really made something of yourself," she said, voice tight, struggling to mask her surprise. I smiled. "It's all from my hard work," I said softly. "No help required." She flinched, a micro-expression that betrayed her internal shock. I watched her carefully, noting how her hands fidgeted, how her eyes darted around the apartment, and how her carefully curated confidence wavered. And then I spoke, slowly, deliberately, choosing my words like arrows aimed at truth. "Do you remember the diner, the apron? When you called me embarrassing? Do you remember how small I felt, how powerless?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Lily, that was a long time ago. It was nothing. I didn't mean it like that." I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of decades of judgment settle in the air between us. It mattered. It mattered every day, every insult, every dismissal. And I've lived through it. I survived, and now I thrive. Her eyes widened slightly, recognition dawning. This was not the timid, obedient daughter she remembered. This was a woman who had endured, who had fought, and who had emerged unbroken. The final step was careful, methodical, almost surgical in its precision. I revealed the condo, the savings, the career, the life she could never have imagined. I showed her the documents, not as threats, not as accusations, but as proof. Proof of my independence, proof that I was no longer under her control. Her face shifted through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally, reluctant admiration. I let it linger. I let her absorb the reality of the life she had failed to influence, the power she had never realized I possessed. The satisfaction was overwhelming, not in anger, not in revenge, but in the quiet knowledge that I had claimed my life, my dignity, my worth. Every insult she had ever hurled, every moment she had dismissed me, every time she had called me embarrassing, it was powerless now, rendered irrelevant by the woman I had become. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream or yell. I simply existed in the truth of my own life, calm, strong, and untouchable. That, more than anything, was the ultimate payoff. The victory was not in humiliation. It was in mastery over myself, over my choices, over the years of suffering she had attempted to impose. And in that moment, as she finally left my apartment, the realization hit her. She had underestimated me for decades, and now she had no control, no leverage, no power. I'd built a life beyond her reach, and nothing she said or did could change it. The satisfaction stayed with me long after she left. It wasn't fleeting or shallow, it was deep, rooted in years of perseverance, resilience, and silent preparation. The girl who had been called embarrassing had become a woman whose life was a testament to endurance and strength. Every late night, every double shift, every humiliating insult had led to this moment, and I savored it quietly, completely, with a calm that only comes from knowing you have finally claimed what is rightfully yours, yourself. After she left, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet, at first, almost unnerving. But it was the kind of quiet I had craved for years, the absence of judgment, of expectation, of eyes that measured my worth against someone else's standard. I walked through my apartment, touching the edges of shelves I had chosen, furniture I had saved for, the walls painted the colors I loved. Every inch of this space was mine. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. For the first time in decades, I felt entirely untethered. My mother's words, her criticisms, her dismissive tone, they couldn't reach me here. They had no power. I was free, and it was intoxicating. It wasn't just about the apartment or the job or the independence. It was about reclaiming myself. The girl who had been called embarrassing had survived ridicule, had endured years of humiliation, and had emerged not only unbroken but thriving. The satisfaction wasn't in revenge, it was in life itself. I reflected on the years I had spent waiting for approval that would never come. Every tear, every exhausting shift, every whispered insult, every moment I had swallowed my own voice. They had built me. They had shaped my resilience, my determination, my understanding that worth is not given, it is claimed. The aftermath of that confrontation with my mother wasn't dramatic, and that was what made it perfect. There were no shouting matches, no tears, no dramatic explosions. Instead, there was a quiet shift in power. I existed in my truth, and she had to confront the reality that she no longer had influence over my life. I began setting boundaries that had once seemed impossible. Phone calls were limited, visits were rare, and when she did reach out, I responded on my terms. The toxic dynamics that had defined my life for decades started to fade, replaced by deliberate choices about how I wanted to interact and with whom. I found joy in small victories, the first paycheck deposited into my account, the first dinner I cooked without oversight, the first weekend spent exploring the city without worrying about judgment. Every ordinary day was a triumph, a reminder that my life was my own, and the satisfaction deepened over time, not because I had won in a conventional sense, but because I had built a life that no one could dismantle. The power I had sought for years was now inherent. I didn't need validation. I didn't need praise. I had autonomy, self-respect, and clarity. In quiet moments, I remembered the girl who had cried in the diner bathroom, trembling at insults and criticism. I honored her struggle by living fully, without apology, without fear. I reminded myself that enduring hardship, facing humiliation, and surviving in a world that underestimated me had forged a strength that no one could take away. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers began to notice the calm confidence I carried. It wasn't arrogance, it was quiet power, the kind that comes from surviving pain and turning it into fuel. For the first time, I wasn't measured against anyone else. I was measured by the life I chose, the choices I made, and the boundaries I set. As months turned into years, the lessons remained. I learned to love myself in ways I had never been allowed to. I cultivated friendships and relationships that honored my worth. I pursued opportunities that aligned with my goals and values, not the expectations of others. And I watched quietly as family dynamics that had once oppressed me lost their grip, leaving me free to exist fully. Looking back, I understood that the ultimate satisfaction wasn't in proving my mother wrong. It wasn't in the confrontation, the subtle triumphs, or the visible independence. It was in claiming myself, in building a life where my value was determined by my choices, my actions, and my resilience. And every time I passed the diner where I had once stood on aching feet, serving coffee and enduring judgment, I smiled quietly to myself. That girl had survived. That girl had thrived. That girl had won. Not because she had revenge, but because she had life in its most authentic, unshakable, and satisfying form. I am Lily. I endured. I overcame. I claimed my life. And in that claim, I found the deepest, most lasting satisfaction I could ever imagine.